Annapurna, for inviting me to this workshop. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as Anu has just told you, I've worked on Navi Mumbai earlier. In fact, my work actually stops in the early 2000s. So what I'm going to present is about mainly the early history and development of Navi Mumbai. And it's very nice for me to be here today because I see that Navi Mumbai continues to interest a whole new generation of young scholars, and that makes my past work worthwhile because the city is always evolving, it's changing, so much to learn. So with that, let me begin. First of all, most of you must know that Navi Mumbai was created in order to reduce congestion on Greater Mumbai. Greater Mumbai was becoming very crowded, and so this new city was thought up. And for a long time, it was one of India's largest urban planning projects in area of about 343.7 square kilometers. At one point, the largest, but as you know now, with the sizes of the nodes they're planning in the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, Navi Mumbai will be overshadowed because you're going to have nodes like Dholera, which will be 800 kilometers and more in size. So at one time it was very large, and I'll start from the beginning, that is, how come such a large area was planned and what was the genesis of the idea of the city, why did people think of extending development across the mainland. And what we see is that the genesis of the idea of mainland development is actually quite old. In fact, in this sense, Navi Mumbai is a contrast to all the smart city planning that you're seeing, which is very quick and sporadic. Navi Mumbai has a long history of thinking before it was actually implemented. And ideas of mainland development go back, in fact, to the 1940s, to the Mia Modak plan of 1947. Later revived again in 1961 in the Bharve Group report. This was a state government committee set up to look into the possibility of mainland development, and they basically endorsed what Mia and Modak had said. Then again in 1964, the issue of mainland development comes up again rather indirectly in the development plan for the Greater Mumbai Municipal Corporation. Basically, in this Greater Mumbai Municipal Corporation plan, one recommendation was to shift industry, heavy polluting industry, from the island and central Mumbai onto the mainland. But the actual blueprint, the first tentative blueprint of the plan of shifting to the mainland doesn't emerge till 1965, and that is contained in the Marg publication. Marg was and still is, it's an art journal, a journal for art and culture that was produced in Mumbai. And in the journal issue, one of the journal issues of 1965 was this tentative blueprint for mainland development, and the blueprint was authored by three very well-known people in architecture: Charles Correa, Parveena Metha, and Sirish Patel. They were the authors of the document. And once this document was studied and sort of propagated, this idea of mainland development became acceptable to the government. And finally, in 1970, CIDCO was formed with the idea of implementing mainland development. So that is, in very brief, is covering many, many years of history. You can see from almost from 47 till 1970. And I've shortened it for this presentation so that I can go into other things. But before I do that, it's important to look at what influenced the choices that the urban planners of the time made with regard to new Navi Mumbai. Did the concept of mainland development and also the way that mainland development was going to occur happen in just out of the blue, or was it really a product of thinking of the time? What were the academic thoughts of the time, what were institutional ideas of the time, and what was national level planning at the time. So national level thinking on development had an influence on the way the mainland was developed. Navi Mumbai was a product of what we call the nationalist era, that is the era post-independence and stopping just before neoliberalization occurs in 1991. So this was a product of that era where certain tenets have been emphasized in economic planning as well as in regional planning, and these are the need for balanced regional growth, the need to disperse industry away from large cities into the hinterland, and thirdly, a certain amount of social and economic equity. So these ideas also are found in the rationalization for mainland development. Secondly, there was also the influence of international organizations, that much of what was happening at the national level again was influenced by what the UN institutions like UNCHS and UNESCO were saying about urbanization, what they were predicting urbanization was going to become in Asian countries, and basically their predictions were showing a massive increase in population. In fact, it's very interesting. There was an article based on UNESCO material which showed that Calcutta by about by 1970 was going to have 40 million people. It's a huge overestimate. Today we still have 4.5 million people. So these kinds of startlingly high projections of urbanization were also causing the government to become very concerned with the congestion in large cities, and so you must decongest, you must disperse population. That was there. And then thirdly, very importantly, was thinking in the profession. What about in the architectural and planning profession? What was being thought of at that time? And predominant in that time, in the post-war II era, was the influence of Ebenezer Howard's Garden City principles, building smaller cities outside a large city in order to decongest the large city. So that was very influential, and along with that, Chandigarh had already been started, and Delhi was being planned through the DDA. So learnings from these cities also seeped into some of the planning choices for Navi Mumbai. In the case of Chandigarh, Charles Correa, for instance, wanted the opposite. He said, we don't want the monumental architecture of Chandigarh. We want a low-rise city, made for the common man. We don't want a monumental city. And in the case of the DDA experience, it's mostly the way Navi Mumbai was financed through what's called the revolving fund method that was taken from the DDA. Then in addition to these, there was also the concerns of big industry. Big industry, as you know, is a big player, particularly in the Mumbai metropolitan region. It was so even in the 60s, very powerful interests of big industry getting disturbed by ideas that heavy industry would have to shift to the mainland. So they also welcomed the blueprint of Correa and his colleagues, because that would mean that maybe they won't have to shift and they can continue on the island and the way they are, with new industrialization coming up on the mainland. Concerns of the middle class also fully supported this idea of a new city. We see it in newspaper writings of the time, in the opinions of certain civic bodies, etc. And for them, building on the mainland meant more affordable housing, because even at that time, housing in Mumbai was very costly for the middle class, and they anticipated cheaper and better quality housing on the mainland. So, broad level, lots of kinds of support coming for this idea of Navi Mumbai, which was, as I was trying to show you, was influenced by several external and internal factors. But of course, there's one very interesting stakeholder that you can see is not part of this, right? Which tells you a lot about planning processes at the time, and that very important stakeholder are the people themselves on the mainland, on whose lands the city would be built. They were never part of this discussion format. They were never drawn into any discussion, and you can see that they are not part of the influences at all. Okay, so after CIDCO got the green signal to begin in 1971, they came up with a draft development plan for the new city, and this development plan is very important because it lays the framework for the city. Now, on and on, the development plan is going to be renewed and changed, but the changes are very marginal. The basic framework remains the way it was envisaged, and it was envisaged to be a center for tertiary employment, not an industrial area. And why tertiary employment? Because one of the big motivations that got the support of big industry was that the government was going to shift from the island to the mainland. The Mantralaya would shift, a lot of the institutions that the state government is in charge of would shift, and that would create a nucleus of employment in the new city. And then also planned for 20 residential nodes, and as I said, this quantum changed over time, and ultimately by the time I finished my work it was 14 residential nodes, not 20. They had reduced it to 14. A new port at Navi Mumbai, and very important was the way that it should be financed, that it should develop as a self-financing project, that it should not depend on the state government, it should somehow be, such that it would recover all the costs of its development. And this is from that draft development plan. This is how the original nodes were planned. 20 of them strung along a mass transit route, which today is both road and rail. So what was the initial driver of growth? Because they're starting growth on a supposedly non-urban area, mostly made up of salt pan and agricultural land. The driver of growth was the process of land development itself. Land was the principal resource of CIDCO. CIDCO was given a little bit of capital, about 5 crores, and some land. And it was going to create infrastructure, sell that infrastructure. With that money, again create more infrastructure. So that's what we call a revolving fund. And so you can see how important land was then for the project. Although there was some government land and there was some land that was given on a voluntary basis, a large chunk of the land for Navi Mumbai had to be acquired. And in 1973, the government notified for acquisition a total of more than 18,000 hectares of land. And this notification affected 19,400 families or 1,17,000 people living in 95 villages or Gauthans. And the Gauthans would remain as they are. This is how Navi Mumbai looked even in the middle 90s when I was doing my work. The city is coming up, but you have the Gauthans, some of which are still very rural. Of course, some of the Gauthans became very urban, one of which most of you who've gone to Navi Mumbai will know, that's Vashi Gaon. That's the first point at which the bus stops after you've crossed the bridge. And it was literally a gaon, but today there's no gaon, it's totally urbanized. So, but in the mid-90s there was still a lot of genuine villages that I came across, and this is what they looked. And straight away you can see there's a duality in the urban development process, the new city coming up, and then the rural sites within that new city, where people had a very different way of life, very different value systems, very different goals and aspirations. And that of course brought it into a lot of conflict with CIDCO, project affected population was very hostile to this whole project, and in the early years, throughout the 70s, they opposed the project as much as they could, slowing down construction. How did they slow down construction? There were even instances of villagers stopping land surveying. Before you can do any building, the land has to be surveyed. So they would go in groups, capture the land surveying instruments, like the theodolites and the other things, and throw them into Thane Creek, just to show their unhappiness with this project. And why were they unhappy? First, in the early years, they were unhappy with the project per se, that this is our home, this is how we live, it's changing. Then over time, when they realized that there was no way out of this, they changed their protest to higher prices. Okay, if we must give you our land, give us good prices for the land. So the shift of the agitations changed across the decades. In the 70s, it was trying to obstruct it in any way they could. In the 80s, it was for higher prices. And over time, the price per acre begins to increase. Government slowly begins to increase price per acre, but even that is not enough, because the villagers were able to come together, and plus they were supported by all the opposition parties at that time in the state. So they had political clout, they brought about a couple of bunds, there were police firings, it was quite violent at times. And then the government realized that, look, this is slowing up the project, development is very slow. In fact, at that time there was only Vashi and a little bit of CBD, Belapur had developed. The rest of Navi Mumbai was still not much developed. So these agitations were slowing things up, and the result was that the government agreed to a negotiation, and in February 1986 the government offered to return a portion of developed land to original owners. That is, since the value of the developed land always is significantly higher than what the government has paid you for the agricultural land that you've sold, this seemed like a good deal to the owners, and the agitations after that petered out. But initially, in fact, when this return of developed land was offered, it was just to 16 villages, not to all the villages, and anybody who accepted compensation was not eligible to this. Because those who had not accepted compensation were eligible. But again, the villagers protested, and they said, what is this? Those who accepted compensation in the old days, they didn't know this was going to happen, so why should they be deprived? So ultimately, it was extended to everybody, but only the landowners. So if you were like a sharecropper on any of the land, if you were a tenant, then it didn't help you. But all the landowners, no matter how large or small your plot, you benefited. So that scheme is a very interesting scheme. It's a 12.5% scheme, it's called, because 12.5% of the developed land was promised as return to the villagers, of which about 30% would be used to improve amenities in the villages, and the balance would go to the original owners for allotment, and the allotment would be on the basis of size of plot that was taken by the government. Okay, so in the early years, CIDCO built housing and shopping complexes, and these are some examples. I'm sure they've all changed. This is LIG housing, MIG housing. This is HIG housing in Vashi Node, Sector 6. These are the kinds of markets that the sectors had. This is in Vashi Sector 6 market with commercial activities on the ground floor, residences on the upper floors. And there was a sequence that CIDCO followed in its land development trajectory, housing stock in the early years, and from the 80s, mostly sale of plots. In the 80s also a number of important things happened. APM, that's the agricultural produce market, was created, business center was created. The 90s on the other hand are characterized mostly by private sector housing activity. And just to show you an example of the difference between CIDCO created housing and housing on private plots. These are much larger, much more lavish as compared to Sidco created housing. And again, I'll just quickly show you this. This is to let you know how over time Sidco's thrust in land development shifted. So in the early years, Sidco's focus was housing. You can see its receipts, 45% of its receipts between 88 and 89 came from the sale of housing. But that percentage decreases over time, and by the mid-90s, it's about 26%. And look at what's happening to developed plots. Developed plots become increasingly more and more important post-liberalization. And that is because Sidco was making much more money through sale of developed plots than through the sale of housing that it had built. So the time that I finished my work actually marks kind of a turning point in the ethos of Sidco from a more public sector, welfare-oriented kind of organization, much more to a marketized, profit-oriented organization. And that continues, I suppose, till the present day, which many of you will talk about, I'm sure. And by the time I finished my work in the mid-2000s, 8 nodes had been completed, and work on 3 large nodes was still just about starting. And the project, which was supposed to be completed in 20 years, you can see has taken much, much longer. That's something also to keep in mind regarding the smart cities. How much time are they going to take, and in the meantime, what is going to happen to the balance cities? And then also to keep in mind is the fact that peopling of these new settlements also takes time. After almost 30 years, Navi Mumbai still hasn't met its target population of 2 million. In 2011, its population was half that. So it takes a long time to build these very large top-down projects, takes a long time to people them, and as you can see, there's a lot of disruption as well. Do I have any time?
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay. So I'll just quickly, before I end, were there any strengths to this model? So what was good about creating this project? Was it all bad? Was it all, negative? Through my work, I found there were certain strengths to the model, especially in light of what we see today, especially in light of the smart city thrust that we are seeing. One is that it was a state-initiated city development. The central government had no role in the planning of Navi Mumbai, in its financing, no role whatsoever. And this is different from the first generation new towns like Chandigarh, Bhubaneswar, and others. The plan for mainland development came from local professionals, but was accepted by the government and implemented. Secondly, mixed housing in all the nodes, including sites and services. This wasn't the case in, in Delhi, and in Chandigarh it was not as mixed as here. Shifting of wholesale markets and truck terminals was also positive. Some flexibility in planning. When offices didn't shift, then Navi Mumbai planners turned their attention to other things like IT, education, electronics, which has been positive for grounding the economic base of the city. There was creation of a large amount of housing stock. This is the quantum when I finished my work, cheaper than Mumbai's, and this was bought by the middle class. In fact, my work shows that most of the residents in Navi Mumbai were people who had shifted from Greater Mumbai into that new city. Then compensation and benefit sharing scheme for the project affected population, which included monetary and non-monetary payments, was also a first of its kind in India at that time. Mostly you had compensation just by Land Acquisition Act, not by developed land. So, of course, how far they've implemented is another story, which I will hear from all of you in the ensuing days. Some other strengths, relative success of some of its low-cost housing schemes, sites and services for Mathadi workers. In early years, they were occupied by Mathadi workers, and there was also some provision for informal markets. This was in Kopar, Khairane, but I believe it's now changed. This was EWS at that time. It's surrounded by HIG housing, so it's possible that market forces have taken over and changed it. This was a cluster type EWS, again in Airoli. This is the kind of provision they had made for informal sector housing, vendors, avenues, and allowing informal sector to continue servicing the markets in the city. This is in Vashi, sector 17 in front. Informal sector was allowed to be there. A little bit of downtown improvement also happened. This is when the Navi Mumbai Municipal Corporation was formed in 1992. Sewerage development in the northern downtowns. This is near Rabale, and this is the kind of buildings I saw in some of the downtowns. This is about 2002. That is, some of them had used their compensation money to rebuild. This is, of course, a large landowner who had got the joint family. They created this lavish housing, but overall there was some improvement in housing through compensation money. And what about the demographic impact? Did Navi Mumbai help to reduce the growth rate of Mumbai? That was the initial purpose of this project. That was the objective number one, why Navi Mumbai was built to start with. And when we look at the broad demographic, the data, we find that post-80s, the growth of Mumbai, Greater Mumbai is coming down, right? And that continues into 2011. If you check the 2011 data, you find that the growth rate has fallen, and the growth rate, in fact, in the island in the last decade has been negative. The island portion of Greater Mumbai has actually lost about 2 lakh people. But again, how far this is due to Navi Mumbai is very difficult to establish. It could just be because industry is leaving Greater Mumbai. That's happening to a lot of older cities like Kolkata. In the last decade lost 79,000 people. Because one thing, I'll just sum up. One thing to remember is that the quality of life in Greater Mumbai is not improving that much because population density within Greater Mumbai has continued. So I'll just stop here. My time is up, and unfortunately I couldn't come to the biggest weakness of the model, which is very clear, is that though it had the opportunity to do so many new things, it was unable to check the growth of slums and was unable to provide any innovative solution to squatter settlements. Though the original blueprint came from such well-known thinkers and planners from the profession, it lost this opportunity to provide us with a very important problem that still besets cities. How to deal with the growth of the city due to the influx of people coming in for jobs. So I'll just stop here.